Hey everyone, welcome back to Mimi Horror Stories. Tonight, we're bringing you another episode of spine-tingling horror tales set against the calming sound of rain. So, get comfortable, hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. It was the winter of 2019, and I was working late in downtown New York City. After a long day at the office, I missed my usual subway line and had to catch a less frequented train on an older route. I was exhausted and just wanted to get home, so I didn't pay much attention to the new route I was on. Around midnight, I found myself at a nearly deserted subway station that seemed unusually quiet. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. As I waited for my train, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual clamor of the subway system was replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional, distant clanking of metal. When the train finally arrived, it was unlike any I had seen before. It was an old-fashioned, vintage train, its design reminiscent of something from the early 1900s. The paint was chipped, and the windows were grimy and opaque, adding to its otherworldly appearance. The train pulled into the station with an almost ghostly hiss, and the doors creaked open. I hesitated for a moment, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. The interior of the train was dimly lit, and the seats were covered in a thick layer of dust. The air was musty, and there was an odd, metallic scent that lingered. Despite my apprehension, I boarded the train, hoping it would get me home quickly. As the train started moving, the lights flickered and the atmosphere grew colder. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks was accompanied by a faint, haunting melody playing over the speakers, something that sounded like a distorted lullaby. I was the only passenger, which only heightened my sense of unease. The train rumbled through the dark tunnels, and I noticed the scenery outside the windows was strange and endless, black void punctuated by flickering lights that seemed to be growing dimmer. Panic started to set in, but I couldn't get off. The doors of the train were inexplicably stuck, and no matter how hard I tried, they wouldn't open. Suddenly, I heard whispering voices coming from the shadows, as if the train itself was alive. The whispers grew louder, and I began to see vague, shadowy figures moving through the train, their forms barely discernible. They seemed to be watching me, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. The train jolted to a stop in a tunnel that was darker than anything I had seen before. The whispers turned into eerie wails, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadowy figures drew closer, their shapes becoming more defined and menacing. The temperature inside the train plummeted, and I could see my breath forming visible puffs of fog. In a panic, I smashed the emergency door release. The doors finally opened, and I bolted out onto the tracks, running through the pitch-black tunnel. I could hear the train's haunting melody, and the wails of the shadowy figures fading behind me as I stumbled into the next station. When I finally emerged into the safety of a brightly lit station, I looked back at the tunnel entrance. It was as if the cursed train had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but the eerie silence of the subway behind. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I later learned that the route I was on had been closed for decades after a series of mysterious disappearances and accidents. Locals spoke of a cursed train that appeared to those who wandered into its path, a reminder of the dark past that the subway system tried to forget. It was the summer of 2018 when my friends and I decided to explore Aokigahara, the infamous suicide forest in Japan. We had heard countless stories about the forest's dark history and eerie atmosphere, and being avid adventurers, we couldn't resist the allure of experiencing it for ourselves. We arrived at the forest in the late afternoon, the sun beginning its descent, casting long shadows through the dense canopy. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. As we ventured deeper, the trees seemed to close in around us, creating an almost claustrophobic feeling. After walking for about an hour, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned railway line cutting through the forest. The tracks were rusty and overgrown with vegetation, giving the impression they hadn't been used in decades. Curiosity piqued, we decided to follow the tracks, wondering where they might lead. As dusk fell, an unsettling feeling began to creep over us. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence enveloped the forest. We joked nervously to break the tension, but our laughter sounded hollow and out of place in the oppressive gloom. Suddenly, we heard a distant, echoing whistle. We all stopped in our tracks, exchanging uneasy glances. There was no way a train could be operating on these abandoned tracks. The whistle grew louder, and soon we could feel the ground vibrating beneath our feet. In the dim light, a ghostly glow appeared down the track, growing brighter with each passing moment. We stood there, rooted to the spot, as the spectral train emerged from the darkness. It was an old steam locomotive, its headlights flickering like lanterns in the night. As the train drew closer, we could see figures inside shadowy, indistinct shapes that seemed to watch us with hollow, mournful eyes. The train was almost transparent, a wraith-like apparition made of mist and shadows. The sound of the engine was deafening, yet it felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. The train passed by us slowly, its ghostly passengers staring at us as if trying to communicate something. The air grew colder, and an oppressive weight pressed down on us, making it hard to breathe. The sensation of icy fingers brushing against my skin sent chills down my spine. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the train faded into the darkness, leaving behind an eerie silence. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what we had just witnessed. My heart was pounding, and I could see the fear mirrored in my friends' faces. We quickly decided to head back, our adventure in Aokigahara cut short by the terrifying encounter. The walk back to our car was tense and silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we finally reached the edge of the forest, we breathed a collective sigh of relief. Later, we learned that the abandoned railway line had once been used to transport goods and workers, but had been closed down after a series of tragic accidents. Some say the spirits of those who died still haunt the tracks, forever bound to their tragic fate. In the fall of 2017, I had just moved to London for a new job and was eager to explore the city's rich history. One evening, after a long day, I decided to take the London Underground home. It was late, and the station was nearly deserted, casting an eerie shadow over the usually bustling place. As I waited for my train, I noticed an old, disused platform across the tracks. It was shrouded in darkness and grime, clearly abandoned for years. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to get a closer look. As I stepped closer, the air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. Then, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the direction of the old platform. My heart pounded as I strained to see through the darkness. The tapping grew louder, accompanied by a distant, haunting whistle that sent shivers down my spine. A ghostly light appeared in the tunnel, growing brighter with each passing second. I stood frozen, mesmerized and terrified, as a spectral train emerged from the darkness. It was an old steam locomotive, its lights flickering like dying embers. The train was almost transparent, a wraith-like apparition made of mist and shadows. The train slowed to a stop at the abandoned platform. Shadowy figures moved inside, their faces obscured, but their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They stared at me with a mournful intensity, as if pleading for help or seeking something they had lost. The air grew colder, and an oppressive pressure made it hard to breathe. The ghostly train's doors creaked open, and I felt a powerful, almost magnetic pull to step inside. Just as I was about to take a step forward, I heard a loud clatter behind me. I spun around to see a station worker, his face pale and eyes wide with shock. "Are you all right?" he asked urgently. The spectral train and its eerie passengers vanished into the darkness, as if they had never been there. The station returned to its normal, lifeless state. My heart raced as the worker guided me to the next arriving train. I was too shaken to speak, and as I boarded, I glanced back at the old platform, now empty and silent. When I got home, I was desperate to understand what I had seen. I dug into the history of that platform and discovered something disturbing. Years ago, there was indeed a tragic accident involving a train that had derailed on that very platform, resulting in numerous fatalities. Witnesses had reported seeing ghostly figures in the aftermath, but those accounts had been dismissed as mere folklore. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spectral train was not just a random apparition, but a manifestation of the souls lost in the accident, trapped in a never-ending loop of their final moments. The chilling realization that I had seen the remnants of such a tragedy made my blood run cold. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a trip along the overland route in Australia with my son, Jake. I'd always been fascinated by trains and the eerie tales of ghostly encounters, and I thought it would be a fun adventure for the two of us. Little did I know, we were about to have an experience that would haunt us forever. We boarded the train in Melbourne, excited for the journey ahead. The scenery was breathtaking, but as night fell, an unsettling feeling crept over me. I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching us, lurking just out of sight. Jake, always the curious and brave one, seemed unfazed and eager to explore the train. After dinner, Jake and I wandered to the back of the train, hoping to take some photos of the night sky. The corridor was dimly lit, casting long, flickering shadows. As we walked, we heard a faint, rhythmic tapping like someone walking with a cane. Jake, intrigued, tugged at my sleeve and urged me to follow the sound. The tapping led us to an old storage compartment that was supposed to be locked. To our surprise, the door creaked open at Jake's touch. Inside, it was pitch dark, but the tapping continued, now accompanied by a soft, almost melancholic whistling. The tapping led us to an old storage compartment that was supposed to be locked. To our surprise, the door creaked open at Jake's touch. Inside, it was pitch dark, but the tapping continued, now accompanied by a soft, almost melancholic whistling. The tapping led us to an old storage compartment that was supposed to be locked. To our surprise, the door creaked open at Jake's touch. Inside, it was pitch dark, but the tapping continued, now accompanied by a soft, almost melancholic whistling. My heart pounded as we stepped inside, the air growing colder with each step. I could barely see, but then I spotted him, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the compartment. He wore an old-fashioned engineer's uniform, and in his hand, he held a lantern that flickered with an otherworldly glow. "Hello," called out, my voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was both sorrowful and stern. His eyes seemed to pierce through me, filled with a sadness I couldn't comprehend. He lifted a gloved hand and pointed towards the end of the train, where the engine was. Suddenly, I was overwhelmed by a flood of images, flashes of a tragic accident, an engineer losing control of the train, the screams of passengers, and finally, a fiery crash. The pain and despair were almost too much to bear. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. Jake, clutching my hand tightly, whispered, "Dad, what's happening?" His voice was shaky, filled with fear and confusion. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. The compartment was empty, save for the lingering cold. I pulled Jake close, and we rushed back to our seats, our hearts racing. I tried to explain what I'd seen to the other passengers, but they just laughed it off, attributing it to an overactive imagination. The rest of the journey passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the vision of the ghostly engineer and the tragedy he'd endured. When we finally arrived at our destination, I spoke to a conductor about what we'd experienced. He listened intently, then nodded solemnly. "You've seen him, then," he said quietly. "The ghost of the engineer who died in the Great Overland Crash of 1912. They say his spirit still rides the rails, searching for peace." Jake and I will never forget that night. The haunted look in the engineer's eyes still lingers in my mind. The overland route is beautiful, but if you ever find yourself on that train at night, be wary. Some spirits never leave, forever bound to the tragedy that took them. And remember, you might not be alone in your journey. Someone from the past might be watching, waiting for their story to be told. In the winter of 2020, my friends and I set out on an adventure into the Paris catacombs. We had always been fascinated by the macabre, and the catacombs, with their labyrinthine passages of bones and history, seemed like the perfect place for a thrilling exploration. We entered through a concealed entrance we had discovered online, descending into the depths beneath Paris. The catacombs were exactly as expected, an eerie maze of skeletal remains and damp, echoing tunnels. We wandered deeper, marveling at the historical artifacts and the eerie ambience. After several hours of wandering, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned railway tunnel that seemed oddly out of place. The walls were coated in dust and spiderwebs, and the tracks were rusted and forgotten. Intrigued, we decided to follow this tunnel, thinking it might lead us to some hidden corner of the catacombs. As we ventured further, the temperature dropped suddenly, and an unsettling vibration seemed to run through the ground. We joked nervously to mask our unease, but the clacking sound grew louder, rhythmic, and haunting, as though something or someone was moving along the tracks. Our breath caught when we saw it, a ghostly light emerging from the darkness ahead. We froze, our eyes widening in disbelief, as a spectral train materialized before us. It was an old steam locomotive, its once bright headlights now flickering weakly in the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The ghostly train seemed to glide silently over the rusted tracks. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels was hypnotic, but it felt wrong, unnatural. Inside the train, shadowy figures shifted restlessly, their faces obscured, but their eyes glowing with a haunting, sorrowful light. It was as if they were trapped in a nightmarish loop, forever bound to this spectral journey. The train drew closer, and we could feel the cold seeping through our clothes, a bone-deep chill that seemed to penetrate everything. An oppressive silence hung in the air, broken only by the mournful whistle of the phantom locomotive. The train's presence was overwhelming, and the figures inside watched us with an intense, almost pleading gaze. Just as the train came to a stop directly in front of us, the air became stiflingly cold, and the pressure seemed to bear down on us. My friends and I exchanged terrified glances, unable to move. The ghostly figures stared at us, their eyes reflecting the tragic stories of those who had perished. Suddenly, the train's doors creaked open with a ghostly wail. We could feel an icy draft sweeping through the tunnel, and the shadowy figures began to reach out, their hands stretching toward us. Panic surged through us, and we instinctively turned to flee. As we ran, the ghostly train began to fade, its light dimming and its mournful whistle growing fainter. We raced through the catacombs, the echo of our footsteps mingling with the fading clacking of the phantom train. When we finally emerged back into the surface world, we were breathless and shaken, our minds reeling from the encounter. Later, we learned that the abandoned railway tunnel had once been part of a system used to transport limestone. Decades ago, a catastrophic accident had claimed the lives of several workers, and it was said that the spirits of those who died had never left. The spectral train was a manifestation of that dark history, forever trapped in the catacombs.